I don't ordinarily spend a lot of time talking about tithing, but it was recently brought to my attention, so I thought I'd share with you some of my adventures with that over the past 40 plus years. When my husband and I first began to study about giving in the scripture, naturally we came across tithing as a principle in both the Old and the New Testament. And so we decided that we would do that. We would obey God's injunction to give and to give the tithe, which is a tenth. Since money is our means of exchange, it was a tenth of our money that we decided to give. Now at that time we had 3 children, a house payment, 1 car, a stay-home mom, and a dog. So you see, we had a busy household, and at that time my husband's income was small. So we sat down to decide on our budget for that first month, and we realized that by giving the tenth of our income, we were going to be cutting short some other needs in the family. Now, they weren't drastic cuts, but they were going to be in the area of food, gas, clothing, entertainment, some of those items that we could kind of shave a little bit off of in order to give a tenth of our income. We did it with prayer and with some trepidation because we had a small income. And in those days, we didn't have a large amount of money in case of an emergency. But in order to obey God, this was our decision. After a few months of watching our pennies very, very closely and of giving right off the top, as soon as my husband's monthly check came in, we cut our tithe out right away. The months went by, and finally one day I had a call from the drugstore that we usually bought medications and things at, and the pharmacy called me and he said, "Mrs. McCoy, have you gotten a new drugstore?" Well, I was a little shocked by his call, and I said, "Why, no, I haven't." And he said, "Well, it's been about 3 months now, and you haven't been by to get a prescription." And as we were talking about that, I suddenly realized what had happened. Whereas my children had been having almost a monthly prescription for one thing or another, all of a sudden they were well. 3 months had passed and the children had not been sick at all. In fact, none of us had. And I realized that suddenly, and so I said, "Oh, Dr. Thompson, guess what? We started tithing and the Lord has kept us well all these 3 months." He said, "Well, as long as the Lord's doing it, it's a good thing." And so that was my first great joy, that God was doing something in our lives in direct relationship to our giving and to our obedience to His direction to tithe. The next thing that happened was all of a sudden a cousin of mine who had two daughters, both the girls were older than my little girl, and there arrived in the mail this box full of clothing from her girls for my little girl. We had a wonderful Christmas in July that time, and things began to happen like that were very unusual for us. On one occasion, $80 was put in our bank account. I argued with the bank about that, and I said we did not deposit $80. Well, the lady said, "It's right here in black and white, and we know that you did, and it is your $80. Nothing I could do would talk her out of that. Then there was a wonderful Saturday that we went to get the sweet potatoes. One of the men that my husband worked with was a farmer, and he said, "I've got a row of sweet potatoes, and so if you'll bring your family out on Saturday, we'll dig sweet potatoes." Well, everybody was excited. We loaded them up in the car, and we had a big Impala at that time. It had a very large trunk, and we thought a row of sweet potatoes, wouldn't be very long. When we got to the farm, I couldn't even see the end of that row of sweet potatoes. It looked like a mile long. Here came the farmer with his big old plow, and our little shovels looked very small in comparison. And down that row he went, tossing up sweet potatoes along the way. Well, you can imagine how thrilled the children were picking up sweet potatoes. This was a whole new experience for them and for us. And so we loaded the trunk of that car with all these sweet potatoes and rejoiced because I now believe that they're the best sweet potatoes in the world that come from Georgia. That poor dirt grows the best sweet potatoes you can find. At any rate, we hauled those sweet potatoes home with the rear end of the car laden down, and we decided we would tithe our sweet potatoes. Well, we didn't actually measure out exactly 1/10 of them, but we took a bag full to all of our neighbors, and they were very, very happy to share in those sweet potatoes. Nothing tastes better to us than sweet potatoes, and I love them to this day. So you see, tithing can be a fun thing. It can be an adventure, because when you obey God, God just pours out His care and blessings upon you. Now what He does all the time. God is a giving God. He's a God that reigns on the good and the bad, and He does wonderful things. But it's an adventure for a Christian to obey God's direction, to give and to tithe. And when you do that, I promise you that it gets to be a wonderful experience. Now 40-some years have passed, and I can tell you from my experience with my family that God has been faithful to open the windows of heaven, like it says in Malachi chapter 3, and to pour out such a blessing that we can hardly contain it. It is a joy in our lives to give that little tenth, and of course, over time that tenth has increased. So we're thankful that God is faithful to His word, and I invite you to step out in your faith and give what you can as God directs, and I promise you that He will be faithful to you.